Is it visible on your end?
Yes, I see it.
Okay, perfect. So I guess I'll start then. I'm gonna set a timer actually. Okay, so my project, actually, my name is Adam Bertrand. My project was how design can revive the library. And the main problem that I saw that kind of made me kind of go after this project is that libraries rely on classification systems that were created during the 19th century, and even though they've been updated with more modern terms, a lot of the categories are still kind of hard and complex to memorize, or even to find in a library. If you were to even find a category that you think it might be under, you'd have to ask a librarian to help you find it, and it might not even be in the same spot. If they knew where it was, it might not be in the same spot even then. So my goal is basically just to make it easier for modern visitors to find books they're looking for, and also books they might enjoy that are related to books they like. So some of the solutions that I kind of came across was maybe I have to just create a new system that adapts to the modern world and is more applicable to modern times. Another solution was to create a mobile application, create a map or a guide that's pretty traditional. If you go to like museums, you see these guides with maps and keys and legends. Another solution that I thought might be, it's actually pretty appropriate now, is virtual reality. We can't go to libraries, so virtual reality is pretty fitting. And I also wanted to try to see if I could do some sort of iconography system, because these classification systems, like the Dewey Decimal System, are based on numbers, and changing to visuals might help people find it, what they're looking for, quicker. So some of the challenges that I kind of faced upon first starting the project was that it's really impossible to create a universal classification system. The Dewey Decimal System, it works to a certain degree because the numerals are very culture to culture accessible. But as far as being kind of humanistic, it doesn't really work that well. People usually rely on words more than numbers, and numbers have a lot more subcategories than just words and categories. So even with systems in place, a lot of librarians even make their own systems within them. So it gets even more complicated. So yeah, like I said, the classification systems, they always change. Even with new time, it's kind of impossible to make them universal, but you can kind of adapt that with technology that already exists, and use technology that people are familiar with, like applications using maps where you pinch zoom and highlight different areas and make routes and all that. People are pretty familiar with that, so it's kind of a more practical direction to go in. But it is still nevertheless a challenge. When I was looking at iconography, some systems that kind of inspired me were Uber, Noun Project, which is a very popular one. GitHub has a pretty large library, Mozilla and Airbnb. And they kind of depict different objects in different ways, but it is pretty universal. But still, it's hard to create one symbol that represents an object, because some cultures, maybe even religious objects, may differ. So it's a little more complicated than just one-to-one category to icon. So that was kind of a bust to match categories with icons. So these are actually the common classification systems. The Dewey Decimal System is very common. Library of Congress is actually the classification system that we use at the Mass Art Library. And the Universal Decimal System classification and the Colin classification is a little bit less common, but still used. Dewey free classification systems were kind of popular after the year 2000, and they basically focus more on going by what the audience is looking at. So if it was maybe a preschool, they would have different categories that would apply to the preschool class instead of maybe a more general category that would apply to higher grades. So it's kind of a little bit more adapted to what the audience is. So theory versus practical is just, I'm just going to like touch upon this really quick because I already talked about it before. Applications are very practical. It's everyone has a smartphone. Google Maps. People are very familiar with Google Maps, and there's more of a theory behind a lot of the augmented reality and virtual reality applications because the audience isn't as large and there's a little bit of a learning curve. So when someone first opens an app, it isn't sometimes it isn't automatically intuitive to how to use this app. So there's a little bit of a problem there with virtual reality. But I think it's important for libraries to be up to date and not ahead of their time. So in that sense, maybe virtual reality isn't exactly fitting. And since everyone does have access to smartphones, having just a regular practical application to assist them in finding books instead of computer just because of the portability might make more sense. And it does make the transition easier when you incorporate a system that's already being used for people that are kind of going into a library for the first time or many times after that. So the pandemic kind of halted a lot of the more ambitious, theoretical kind of directions I want to explore, like seeing what augmented reality would look like, taking pictures of the library, seeing how maybe you can interact with the different aisles and different sections of the actual library. So that kind of affected user testing and on-site photography and research. Communicating with staff in person also is a lot more effective. Going through emails, it's a little slower. I think now that we're kind of used to video chatting, I think that's also a good solution. But being there in person, having them walk through how these libraries are organizing and how the different audiences that are visiting are interacting with these sections that these librarians are organizing, because they even have like featured or new books on top of the already existing classification system. But in this pandemic environment, it's kind of interesting because virtual reality becomes that much more convenient because everyone's already at home. So if someone has virtual reality, they can almost go to the library virtually, look at the books instead of going there and maybe even selecting a book and adding it to a virtual cart. And that way it gets added or sent to their home. And as theoretical as that sounds, I think in this pandemic, that is a little bit more realistic and could actually be pretty effective. But I think reasons to revive a library, on top of the reasons I already said before, where the classification system is so old and not a lot has been done to kind of move it into the modern world, is that these libraries are dedicated spaces that facilitate learning, and there's not a whole lot of distractions. It's a pretty quiet environment, and I think most students take this very seriously. There's a lot of resources that are used on a daily basis in libraries, including computers for people that don't maybe have access to computers, on top of books and also media like DVDs and newspapers and archives and all this kind of pre-existing knowledge that is reliable, and it isn't it's going to encourage people to actually look up the source and not to just look at an article online. And it might discourage fake news and teach people more about facts and things that aren't fake news. So some of the research that I did upon first proposal was a lot of physical media. So like maps. I looked at Lowe's because they they have a augmented reality app in beta that looks pretty interesting, where you can kind of type in what you want and it'll draw a path using the map that's already on the app, and you'll be able to find what you're looking for in a pretty quick manner. I mean, there's a little bit of lag, but for the most part it works pretty well and it's pretty intuitive, but um, it'll definitely drain your battery life pretty quick. But Home Depot kind of has a little bit more practical application, where it's just kind of a 3D map that you can scroll and tap different aisles, and it's a little bit more self-explanatory and practical. But IKEA also, the way they organize their system and inventory is by aisle and bin, similar to how Lowe's does it. And this works really well because it narrows down what aisle. It kind of gives you the bigger picture of where you need to go and where you need to get your stuff. So you kind of find, the display room, see how it looks, and then find it in the back. And it's a very intuitive experience, and the path is very clear on the printed maps. And I kind of drew some inspiration from that originally when I was prototyping paper prototypes. Because it kind of made me think about, well, if a furniture store makes you want to look at the furniture for it first and then pick it up and know where to pick it up, maybe if you go to a library, you can read the book at first, and then it kind of the app allows you to find different books that you might be interested in, and then you can kind of keep track of how many books you're renting, and kind of has more connection to the library, like having different bookmarks, having recorded what books you've been renting out, etc. Even the Met is kind of interesting because their guides are bilingual, so that kind of shows the audience that it's going to the museum, and kind of adapts for it by supplying different language guides. So when I was refining the prototype, originally I wanted to do a paper prototype, but I just saw the potential of an app working so well, and everyone was so familiar with an app, and it's just so efficient and quick to search for books. I think a lot of people are used to even clicking Control F, and that's a pretty common thing, I think, nowadays, especially at classes or online. Finding keywords in long papers, or even searching for items on Amazon. People are pretty familiar with using keywords, not quite looking exactly what you're looking for, but rather going around it. And maybe if you're looking for a comic, you can look up more general things like graphic novels instead of maybe the title of the book. So it has a little more flexibility, and the ability to look at the individual books and look at a kind of a broader view of the library that you are close to, depending on what library you are at, is nice, because you can actually see what aisle the book is in and what shelf and all that, and it makes it very streamlined and easy versus kind of having to tilt your head and kind of look at the labels, or however you find a book normally at a library. And this app would have a library by library inventory, so you can change the library depending on what library is closest to you, and it'll upload it'll know what system, whether it's Dewey Decimal or Library of Congress, and it'll adapt and allow you to not be faced by these different systems, and rather just give you a straight, this is where the book is and this is the number that you're looking for. So that kind of helps streamline the process of finding a book. And I have the actual walkthrough of the application. I can pull that up. Let's see. Oops. Okay. So this is just the application, quick onboarding, where you're just typing in your name, email. The zip code will allow you to locate the library that's closest to you. You can choose interests. So if you're interested in museums or history, it'll kind of create books that are based on those. And if you want to go back and change, you can change the library. and anytime. Look up your library card, so you always have it with you. Have them scan it. It keeps track of all the books you're borrowing, and if you want to reserve it through the application, it'll put it on hold, but you can also return it through the application. Um, so on top of books you borrowed, it also keeps track of the books that you've owned and purchased. And when you actually search the map, when you click it by category, maybe you're going for N, which is I believe fine art. You can select, if you already know the categories, you can select the a book you're looking for that way, or you can just type it in. Let's say you're looking for Van Gogh, it'll pull up all the Van Gogh books that are in that section. If you don't necessarily know, maybe N is fine art or D is painting, you can just look it up by what you want. So if you maybe just want graphic novels, it'll adjust the app to tell you what class and subclass it is. So in this case, graphic novels would be under class P and then subclass N. So that just gives you another way to kind of find what you're looking for. And I mean, that's basically the app. There's 4 sections. So when your home screen kind of shows you newly added and top rated, and if you scroll down, there's more recommended. The actual map, the books, to keep track of the books that you are borrowing, owned, or even returned. If you just didn't like them, you can even go back to them. You can also favorite books, and if you owned a book that maybe you didn't get from a library or didn't get from that library, you can scan it in and see what date maybe you scanned it in or rented it at the top. So there's a little bit more flexibility, and there's a little bit more data associated with an application. Maybe, you know, these libraries have systems that keep track of it, but having it, convenience of it on your phone, isn't anything that I've seen, and I thought that would be really convenient as someone that goes to the library or used to go to the library frequently. So yeah, that's basically that. Kind of finished a little early. Yeah, right here it actually says ND1349. So if you actually looked at it on the shelf, that's what number would be on the spine, because it's normally on the bottom section of the spine. So that's actually how you would find it, is that number. And if you want to know what aisle you're in, it actually tells you the top also. Not sure if I mentioned that, but also libraries that have multiple floors, this keeps track of that too. So maybe you're in the main lobby, second floor, or the basement. You can switch the floor by going to the top and changing that. Okay.
All right. Thank you, Adam. Let's give it up.